Allora, buonasera a tutti e benvenuti a questo webinar dal titolo Reviewing and Troubleshooting Your HEC-RAS Model. Ringraziamo Chris per la sua presenza come prima cosa. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I have 4 slides for introduction, and after Chris go with your presentation.
Okay.
Introduction is in Italian language. Naturally, presentation is in English. Allora, grazie a tutti ancora per la vostra presenza e benvenuti all'interno di questo interessante live al quale ho tenuto meglio a organizzare in queste ultime settimane. Vi introduco velocemente il mio canale YouTube Modellazioni idrauliche GIS, che naturalmente vi invito a iscrivervi. Inoltre faccio presente anche che sia su Facebook è presente il gruppo HEC-RAS Italia e inoltre su Telegram potete trovare il canale YouTube, il canale Modellazioni idrauliche GIS. Questi link li trovate nella parte dedicata alla descrizione. Infine, naturalmente per chi mi segue già lo fa, per chi ancora non lo ha fatto lo invito a fare. Vi invito a iscrivervi all'interno della newsletter. Anche in questo caso trovate il link dedicato nella parte riferita alla descrizione alla mia newsletter, e pubblicherò tra il mese di maggio e il mese di giugno delle linee guida dedicate alla modellazione idraulica 2D, che saranno gratuite e saranno inviate esclusivamente per chi è iscritto alla newsletter. Grazie per l'attenzione. Scusate questa piccola introduzione e passo la parola a Chris per la sua presentazione. Ok?
Okay. Are we ready, Antonio?
Yeah. Go.
Okay. Grazie, Antonio. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am going to be talking about reviewing and troubleshooting your HEC-RAS model today. I have a short amount of time to do this, and this is a topic where we could talk for days and days and still not reach the end of the discussion. So what I want to do today is give you some high points, some overall general strategies for how you approach troubleshooting your model. Then we're going to talk about some specific and common stability issues that you may have with a HEC-RAS unsteady flow model and some of the things that you can do to fix those. With that, let me jump right in. And Antonio, if there are questions, I'm happy to take those during the presentation, if that makes sense. But we'll have some time at the end as well to cover some questions. All right, so this is a very common question I get. People will email me or they'll post this on a HEC-RAS forum. I'm sure, Antonio, you've gotten this question before too, but my HEC-RAS model has crashed. Why? There's no way for anyone to answer this question with only this information. You need more than this to understand why your model crashed. It's impossible to troubleshoot based on that statement alone. So I'll normally come back and say, hey, I need some more information. What have you done? What kind of model is it? What version? Things like that. And a lot of times, simply going through the act of describing your model, what kind of a HEC-RAS model is it? What were some of the more recent changes you made to the model before it crashed? Sometimes going through that process will lead you to the answer of why your model is crashing. And you may not even need me to help after that. But at the very minimum, you need some information about the model to be able to answer it. So when I say troubleshooting, what am I talking about? What is troubleshooting? So in general, if you look in just computers in general, the definition of troubleshooting is the process of diagnosing and solving computer errors or technical problems. But when we're talking specifically about HEC-RAS, it's more the process of diagnosing those errors and instabilities and fixing them while maintaining a model that is usable and defensible. And that's the key thing. We want to make sure that we're not fixing our model, we're not stabilizing it at the expense of a model that's usable and defensible. And what do I mean by that? Well, we want a model that's accurate, and we want a model that we can use to confidently answer questions for whatever project we're working on. So when we're getting into troubleshooting, there's a couple things to consider. There are errors that happen all the time, but there's also instabilities. Now, they're very similar in a lot of ways, but actually quite different. An error can be either computational or it can be with your input. So when I'm talking about computational errors, I'm talking about the errors that are naturally part of the HEC-RAS software that are there simply to make it a usable tool. There are a lot of relationships between hydraulic parameters and, say, time or space, how those things change in time and space, that can't be analytically solved with an equation. There's a continuous function, if you will, a df dx, as you see on the right here, this continuous function. And this may represent a hydraulic property. It could be hydraulic radius, it could be velocity, it could be depth, it could be anything, and how it changes in space. So that's what the x-axis here, this is space. Well, to be able to use that relationship in our model, we have to interpolate sometimes in between discrete points. And so when you interpolate, if you land in between discrete points during your simulation, whether it's in between cross sections or in between time steps, RAS has to interpolate. And every time it interpolates and uses a linear interpolation to describe a nonlinear function, you're going to have some error. And that error is the difference between this curved line and the dashed line. So that's error that's built into the software that just makes it possible to use. There's also discretization errors. So these are errors that come about when RAS is trying to solve these equations in a discretized format. So again, we have this continuous function that we can't solve analytically, so we solve it with numerical methods, and one being a discretization. Here we go from your continuous df dx to a discretized delta f over delta x, again, the dashed lines. And anytime you approximate a derivative with a discretized form, you're going to have some error. Now, there are better ways to approximate that derivative than others, but there will always be some error. So these errors are acceptable as long as they're small and they don't become a computational burden. A lot of times you won't even notice those. They're so small you won't even see them. Now, there's also errors with input. These are errors that you must take care of, or you at least must be able to quantify and understand, because this is error with things like your input data or even the quality of data that you're using. Say, for example, your terrain. If you have a terrain with very low resolution, that is potentially a source of error in your model, depending on the type of model you're building. Okay, so normally you're going to want to take care of your input errors, or at least be able to quantify them. As long as your computational errors are small and not noticeable and they're not causing a computational burden, you can leave those alone. Now, for instabilities, these are errors that go out of control. They get too large and you end up with wildly unrealistic answers. And once those results get so out of control, the model will eventually just crash. It says, hey, I can't deal with this error. I'm going to go ahead and halt the program, and that's an actual crash. Now, not all instabilities can cause a crash. You can see results like I've shown down here, where we have some very unrealistic water surface elevations. Okay, but the model hasn't crashed yet. It's able to power through this. But this is incorrect. This needs to be fixed. You can't accept an instability like that. So when we start our process of troubleshooting or fixing our model, think of your model as being in a computational balance, a balance between the accuracy of your results, the stability of your model, as well as the efficiency of your runtime. If you were to make your model too accurate and you put too much weight on this ball over here, these two, this becomes out of balance, these two will fall off, and we no longer have a model that's usable. Same thing over here. If you put too much weight on stability at the expense of accuracy and efficiency, then we're not going to have a model that we can use. Okay, so there is a balance, and there's a trade-off a lot of times where you may trade a little bit of accuracy for stability or for model efficiency. Just understand that that's what you're doing, and understand the consequences of sacrificing a little bit of that accuracy in your model. Now, troubleshooting is something that doesn't happen at the end of your model. It's not, I finished my model, I've run it, now it's broken and I have to troubleshoot it. No, troubleshooting starts before you even start with your model, before you even open the software, in the planning phase. And what I mean by that is you need to know the objectives of your modeling effort. Why am I building this model? What are the questions I'm trying to answer with my model? That's going to help you build your model as efficiently as possible and leave out the things you don't need that may cause your model to crash. Know the limitations of the software as well. HEC-RAS, just like any other hydraulic or modeling software, has limitations. Well, you know, an easy one is we can do 1D or 2D modeling, but we can't do 3D modeling. We can't look at vertical acceleration of flow. If that's a limitation, that's going to make it difficult for you to answer the questions you've defined in your objectives, then maybe HEC-RAS is not the right model for you. Or maybe it's a tool you can use to help answer some questions, but you know that maybe your answer is not perfect. It has a little bit of error associated with it. This is going to lead you to determine how you're going to set up your model. Is it a 1D model or a 2D model? Or maybe it's a combination 1D, 2D model. And are we doing this in steady flow, unsteady flow, or even quasi-steady, where we run long durations of simulation with constant inflows to try to achieve a equilibrium state? These are all different techniques to use, and they'll address questions that you have under your objectives different ways. So understand the limitations. Think about how you're going to set up your model, all in the planning phase before you even open the software. Now, the next stage is construction. This is where you go to build your model. If it's a 1D model, you'll build it with cross sections. If it's a 2D model, you'll lay a two-dimensional mesh over a terrain. Could be a combination 1D, 2D model, in which case you'll have cross sections and a 2D mesh. But to best set yourself up for having a working model that takes very little effort to troubleshoot, you want to start with the idea of simplicity. So build your model as simple as you can while still being able to answer the questions you've laid out in your objectives. Okay, so think of simplicity. Don't add everything in there if you don't need it. Okay, the more elements, the more detail you add into your model, the more chance for errors and instabilities, and the more difficult it is to troubleshoot. So also, it's a good idea to build your model with a staged approach. So that means start off with just a basic model. If it's a 2D model, just put your mesh in there, run it, look for errors, fix those errors. Then maybe you add in a bridge or a storage area, SA2D area connection, or a dam where you might put in a breach. Add those things one at a time in a staged approach and run the model in between each addition. The reason for that is because if you run your model after adding in a bridge and it crashes, then you know it has something to do with that bridge. Whereas if you build the entire model with everything in it and then run it and it crashes, you may not know what's causing that crash. There's nothing better than experience, too, when setting up and troubleshooting and reviewing a HEC-RAS model. Think of things as you're building your model, or even before you get started. What are some things in my past experience that have caused models to go unstable or have made things difficult for me? And avoid those. So you're always learning. I'm still learning. Every day I get into HEC-RAS and I'm working on a model or I'm reviewing a model and I learn new things. Okay, there's never a point where you're done learning with HEC-RAS. And so use that to your advantage. Use that experience to help you with your model construction. Now, the third part in the timeline for troubleshooting is the execution. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, this happens multiple times. There's not one model execution. If you build your model in stages, you're going to be running your model in between each stage. And so part 2 and part 3 sort of blend together here in the troubleshooting timeline. But during execution, you're going to be looking for computation messages. And you see those scrolling through here as your model's running. When your model's finished, look at the volume accounting. If the volume accounting errors are quite large, that's an indication your model's unstable. And you'll have to go figure out why and go fix it. Look for visual clues as well after the model has run. Look at your profile plots if you have a 1D reach. Look for unrealistic answers. Look for spikes. Look for your water surface bouncing up and down. That's a visual clue of an instability. And then further look and see if you can figure out where that instability originated from. When you see your water surface bouncing up and down, if you back off on the animation, you may be able to pinpoint where exactly that instability started. And there's a clue for you as to what's causing your model to go unstable. You can see the same thing in your 2D maps in RAS Mapper. Look for pulsing. Look for velocity hotspots. Look for things that are just not making sense to you, okay, that don't look realistic. Stage and flow hydrographs are also a great way to check for errors and instabilities. And they'll show up very readily in there if you do have instabilities. And then you may just have to get into your tables and look at the numbers and see if the numbers make sense. Are they consistent from one cross-section to the next or from one cell to the next? Do you have any unrealistically high numbers? Okay, and then finally in the troubleshooting timeline, we have step number 4, which is model review. Now, you as the builder or the developer of your model also play a big part in the review. In fact, as you're building and executing your model and checking for errors, that is reviewing. So notice that these bullet points are the same. Look for the computation messages. Look for volume accounting, visual clues. These are all things that you should be doing as the developer before you hand your model off to be reviewed by somebody else, who will then essentially do the same thing. But the difference here with the model reviewer is they likely have more experience or a different level of experience than you do that they can use to dig a little bit deeper or maybe find things that you haven't noticed yet because you've been immersed in building your model. So it's a good independent check, okay? But you're essentially looking at the same thing. So how do you know if your model is unstable? We talked a little bit about this already, but once you've run your model, the first check is the computation window. Okay, this is the window that pops up as the model's running, and it shows you all of the different messages. Sometimes they're error messages, other times that's just informational. But if you do see a lot of error messages scrolling through as the model's running, that's an indication at a minimum that you have some errors that you may have to work through. But if those errors are quite large, that's an indication that your model is going unstable. And then eventually, if those errors get too large, the model will crash. And that's a great indication that your model has gone unstable. Look at the volume accounting errors at the end of the run. So over here is our computation messages, computation window. Once it's finished at the very bottom or towards the bottom, you'll see a few lines of volume accounting. And if your volume accounting is out of control, the percent difference is too high, that's an indication your model is unstable. Look at your profile plots. If you have 1D reaches, this is a great example of a model that is going unstable. Okay, notice the spikes in water surface elevation, the very high, unrealistic results. This just clearly does not make sense. You can't have a wall of water sitting in the middle of your reach like this. This is an instability. Now, you've got a couple clues already right here because this looks to be the largest spike right here, and it happens to be right on top of a bridge. Okay, so that's a very good clue as to what's causing your model to crash here. Something with this bridge. And so you would go and look at your bridge, look at your input data at the bridge, look at ineffective flow areas upstream and downstream of your bridge, and see if that can help you figure out what's going on and how you might fix it. So look for the pulsing and look for spikes. As you animate this, if you see waves and spikes moving around, that's pulsing. In the stage and flow hydrographs, look for oscillations. Notice here we've got a flow hydrograph at some cross section, and you see the water bouncing around. Now, sometimes you'll get this in the flow hydrograph, but you won't notice any spikes or oscillations in the water surface hydrograph or the stage hydrograph. So just looking at stage like we're doing up here may not answer all the questions. You may see a really nice smooth profile through here, but then you look at the flow hydrograph and you've got all these spikes and oscillations in there. Okay, so this would be an obvious place to go look at this particular river station to see why am I getting these oscillations in my flow hydrograph. And then in RAS Mapper, you can look at maps and look for things like pulsing. Pulsing is just a plan view form of these spikes that you get in profile form. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a second. Look for velocity hotspots. This is a great example of a velocity hotspot. And notice the velocity here, 9,228. It doesn't matter if we're talking meters per second or feet per second. That is unrealistically high, obviously. And so that's an error. Now, RAS in a 2D model, it can actually handle these unrealistic numbers quite well. And it might actually look like it's stable. In fact, the rest of your modeling domain may be very stable, and you just have this instability isolated to this one spot. Okay, so you're not necessarily going to see a lot of errors in here in the computation window when you've got a 2D model, because 2D models can recover quite easily. So look for these velocity hotspots, and then you have to fix those. Pixelation is another clue as to an instability or at least an error. If you see, especially at the front of a flood wave in your map, as it's moving through your system, if the front edge looks pixelated, it's normally because it's sending too much water into the next cell or a neighboring cell that it fills up very quickly, and you get this kind of square pixely look to the front end of your flood wave. And usually that's a Courant number issue that you have to work through. So let me step through some common stability issues. I'm going to touch on just a few here. I don't have enough time to talk about all of them, and I honestly don't even know what all of the stability issues in RAS. Again, I'm learning every day with HEC-RAS like everybody else. But I do see a lot of common ones out there. And with many years of experience in dealing with these types of issues, I found out some tricks and tips on how to fix those. So I've got some of that listed out here. But whenever you see a choppy and spiky profile, like you see right here in a 1D reach, that's an instability. It can happen anytime in your simulation. It can happen anywhere. It could be the entire reach goes unstable. Normally, this is because of a few things. One, either your time steps are too large. This should say time steps too large. Sorry, not too small. That's my bad. Cross-section spacing is too large. Okay, so having more cross-sections can sometimes help. Sometimes you're just running a low-flow scenario and your depths are so low that RAS has a tough time dealing with those. Adding more cross-sections in that case can help, or smaller time steps can also help. But sometimes you just need to have more base flow and a little bit more depth added, maybe a higher N value. Steep reaches and sharp drops are a common place or common source of these choppy and spiky profiles. Also, dynamic floods. If you're running a very dynamic hydrograph through your system, maybe it's a flash flood or it's a dam break. Okay, RAS has a tough time with that because things are changing very quickly and very sharply. And to be able to handle that, you need smaller time steps. You need closer cross sections. Sometimes you're running a model in a supercritical reach. It's below critical depth. And RAS has trouble with that. Okay, that's very difficult for RAS to solve the equations when it's close to critical depth or even in supercritical flow. That's when you may want to use the mixed flow option in unsteady flow. Another common one is initial conditions. And if you ever run your model and you see the red bars right at the beginning of the simulation, it just crashes right away. that is a good indication that you have an initial condition problem. And this can happen with both 1D and 2D models, but it usually happens at the beginning of your simulation because it is, after all, a problem with your initial conditions. Now, this can happen anywhere, but it's commonly located at your boundaries, either your upstream boundary or your downstream boundary of your reach. If you have a 1D, 2D combination model, a lot of times it happens at the 1D, 2D boundary. Okay, why does this happen? Well, it usually boils down to one thing. RAS has a difficult time resolving the differences between your initial condition assumptions and what's happening at the very first time step of your simulation. Okay, there's lots of tricks to get around this. One of the easiest ways is if you have a 1D model is make sure that your initial conditions flow is the same as your first time step flow. And so let me bring this up really quick. I want to show you where this is. So in here we have a flow hydrograph, okay, as our boundary condition, flow hydrograph. If I open that up, you'll see that my first flow, this is my first time step flow, is 1000. Okay, I would want to make sure that my initial flow is also 1000. Now, this is a trick in the latest version or latest few versions of RAS. If you leave this blank, RAS will automatically use this first time step flow as your initial conditions flow. But let's say I don't leave it blank, and instead of 1000, I put 2000 in here. That's going to cause trouble. It could cause your model to crash. At the very least, you're going to get some errors at the beginning of your run. So either leave this blank and let RAS figure out what the initial flow should be, or make sure the value you put in here is equal to your first time step flow. Okay, that's a really easy one to fix, but very common to cause initial conditions problem. If you've got a 2D model or a 1D 2D model, you may need what's called initial conditions time. This is some time before the simulation where RAS will disconnect your 2D areas from your 1D reaches, run them independently, and if you run enough IC time, then you'll get to a point where things have settled out from your initial conditions assumptions and they match your first time step much better. So that's just running some initial conditions time up front. Warm-up time is very similar. It's another technique where you run some time before your simulation. But in this case, the warm-up time keeps your model fully connected. It doesn't disconnect it like it does in IC time. So that's another technique. And sometimes just using a restart file can help you get through initial conditions problems. Okay, I mentioned low depths before, but let me highlight this a little bit more because it is usually a relatively easy thing to fix. You just have to know what's happening. This can happen anytime in a 1D reach, and it can happen anywhere depths are low. Take, for example, this example or this profile on the left-hand side where I've got a fairly steep drop, and you can see my cross-section spacing is relatively coarse. And as the water goes over the steep drop, it hits critical depth. Maybe it's a little bit below critical, maybe a little bit high, but it's close to critical depth. And RAS compensates or overcompensates by producing a higher water surface elevation upstream of this. Now, RAS may be able to work with this and run this in a stable condition, but if at a very minimum, this is an error that you need to work out. So adding some cross sections can help smooth this out. Now, a lot of times as you're animating, you'll see this happen. And then the very next time step, it's all out of control and unstable. You've got your water surface bouncing all over. And so if you back up one time step or one output interval to this spot, you can clearly see this is the source of the error. And adding some cross sections around that grade break, giving it more resolution, can help. Now, there could be other things causing the trouble too. Maybe the survey data is just poor here. You don't have good bathymetric data built into your cross sections. You might want to try using pilot channels in a case like this. This is an old technique that's been around a long time that helps to provide some artificial depth to your cross sections, which computationally is beneficial. It adds more stability. But when you do use a pilot channel, you're also sacrificing a little bit of accuracy. So this gets back to that balance between accuracy, stability, and efficiency. Okay, with a pilot channel, you're sacrificing a little bit of accuracy for stability. It could be a problem with your HTAB definition. So every cross-section here is pre-processed into a series of tables of hydraulic parameters and how they relate to stage. And if those tables and plots are not well defined, if there's not enough resolution in there, that can cause trouble. You may just be near critical depth, in which case you may want to turn on your mixed flow options or take a closer look at your end values. A lot of times when you see a lot of critical depth in your 1D reach, that's an indication that you're underestimating your Manning's end values. Okay, so take a closer look at those. And RAS has a new finite volume technique built into 6.0 and later that does a much better job computationally with low flows and even will allow your 1D reach to go dry. And so you may look at using this finite volume technique that's new in HEC-RAS. 1D, 2D boundaries, if you've got a combination 1D, 2D model, are a very common source of errors and instabilities. And that's because RAS is using 2D equations and computation methods to solve for the cells along the boundary here, but it's using the 1D methods and limitations to solve for for parameters, hydraulic parameters on the cross section or the 1D reach side of this. Those two answers could be different, and when they're different, those are errors, and those errors can then propagate upstream into the 2D area or downstream into the 1D reach, and they can oscillate into instabilities. And so how do we fix that? Well, first of all, you want to try and place your cross section right on top of the 2D boundary. That way they're sharing the exact same terrain. Okay, that's going to give you the best chance of having the results look similar enough. It's also a good idea to place this boundary in a very one-dimensional part of your river. You would never want to put this in a two-dimensional part of your river because while the 2D area may do just fine there, the 1D reach is not going to compute well in a 2D area. So move it to an area that's very one-dimensional in nature. Make sure the end values you assign to those cells are the same as the end values that you have on the cross section at the boundary. Okay. You still, after all of that, may have some errors and differences between the results over here on the 2D side versus the 1D side, in which case you can use 1D and 2D iterations to allow RAS to try and have some sub-time step computations to try and balance out or minimize those errors before moving on to the next time step. Helps to keep them in check. Okay. Anytime a cross section goes dry because the 2D area is dry, if it goes dry on this boundary, that's going to cause your model to crash unless you're using the finite volume technique. Okay. So keep that in mind. You want to keep those cells wet on the boundary. Bridges are a very common source of stability, especially in 1D reaches. 2D bridges are a lot more robust. They, in theory, could cause some errors and instabilities, but I think because they're surrounded by many, many more computation points, any errors that come out of a bridge are quickly tamped down. They're quickly dampened out with all of the computation nodes around that bridge. But with a cross section or with cross sections in a 1D reach, you can get errors that go out of control. They oscillate and cause your model to crash. Okay, why does this happen? The number one source I've seen is with the HTAB definitions. A lot of times, just adding resolution to your HTAB curves for that bridge can solve this problem. But a lot of times, it's how you set your ineffective flows upstream and downstream of your bridge. If there's not consistency upstream and downstream to your bridge and how much flow is distributed out in the overbanks versus the main channel, that can cause errors and instabilities. So look for consistency around bridges in your flow distribution and also when your ineffective flows turn on and off as the water goes up and down. Obviously, pore coefficients, bridge coefficients, whether you're talking the weir coefficients or orifice coefficients, those can have an effect. And then it may be that what you're modeling as a bridge would be better modeled as a culvert, in which case maybe you switch to a culvert to get through that problem. Lateral structure is another common issue, and this could be 1D or 2D models. In a 2D model, it will be an SA 2D area connection. Okay, so the same type of thing can happen. Notice here on the water surface or the elevation or the stage hydrograph plot, looks fairly smooth, looks pretty good. But when we look at the flow hydrograph, it's bouncing all over the place. Okay, this is an indication that you have a submergence problem. In other words, the tailwater on the downstream end of this structure, whether it's a lateral structure or a connection, is high enough that it's causing submergence on the structure itself. And that can really cause trouble with RAS and computing the amount of water that goes over that structure at any given time step. Okay, you can also get just a sudden increase in flow when the water first goes over the top. Okay, to fix that, you may want to increase or decrease your weir coefficient, or even break up your structure into smaller lateral structures. But if you do feel like you have a submergence issue, and this is a very clear indication of that, think about using your decay exponents. Okay, and let me show you where that is. In the options, computation options and tolerances, you'll see we have these decay exponents down here. If you increase those to 3 from their defaults of 1, that can add a lot of stability for a situation like that and may fix it by itself. Okay, adding or increasing your decay exponent will add stability, but at the expense of a little bit of accuracy. Normally, it's not that much error that you're introducing. Your weir coefficient can help. Again, lowering your weir coefficient, if appropriate, can stabilize that better. Or you may just switch to the normal 2D equation domain. Okay, that's an option. Instead of using the weir equation at a lateral structure going into a 2D area or at an SA 2D area connection, you can switch to the normal 2D equation domain. And instead of using the weir coefficient, it'll just treat it as a normal part of your 2D area. And that can be much more stable under submergence conditions. Okay, now this doesn't a lot of times cause an instability, but you will get error messages if your adjacent cells are higher than the weir itself. So these are things you have to fix up. Bottom line is, if you're having trouble with a structure, lateral structure or a bridge, make sure you get into the manual too and read up, because all this stuff is talked about in the manual itself. You just have to go look for it. Now, I mentioned pulsing as an indication of an instability. And this can happen anywhere in a 2D area, anytime. Okay, and it's almost always because your Courant numbers are too high. So this is an easy fix, but you may not see it in your computation window. So when you go through and you're looking at your results, animate and look for areas of pulsing. And this is what it looks like. Notice as the flow's coming through here, you get these waves coming through, and you can see those as pulsing through a profile plot. Okay, this is easily fixed with really just decreasing your computational time step, your computation interval. You might also increase the size of your cells, but usually we don't like to make our cells bigger. So usually it's a decrease in your time step to get your Courant numbers correct. All right, this is the trickiest one out here. A lot of you have probably seen this. I see this all the time. A lot of times people will send me a screenshot of this and ask, what does this code mean? This unknown code right here. And I have no idea. In fact, I don't even think the developers of the software know what these codes mean. Okay, what this means is there's something wrong with your model, but we don't know what it is. Okay, so every once in a while you'll have a model where it's crashing and you have no idea why. Okay, so one thing you can do is you can look at some of the messages before and see if that gives you a clue. One thing I can see here is I've got some error messages at that particular cell right before we got this series of unknown error messages. Okay, I can go look at my results. I can find this cell at that time step and see what's happening at that point. Okay, and see if that lends me a clue to work with. Sometimes, though, you get nothing in your messages before you get the unknown errors, and you have nothing to go with, no clues, nothing. In which case, this is going to be a very difficult one to fix. Okay, there's no way around it. You don't know why it's crashing. So what you have to do is number one, check your inputs. Look for some obvious errors in your inputs. It could be a simple typographic error. You meant to put an n value of 0.035 and you put 0.0035. Okay, that's an error that can easily be fixed. So look for those. An easy thing to try is another HEC-RAS version. Let's say you're working in version 6.2, which is the latest version, and this happens, then try it in 6.1 and see if it runs fine. If that is the case, it may be that 6.2 just has a bug, and you may have to run this in 6.1 instead. If that doesn't work, try deconstructing the model and rebuilding it in stages. Again, doing this staged approach where you build your model one element or one component at a time and running in between, and that can sometimes show you where the error is. Or you may just try to force stability with really high depths or high n values, and then maybe slowly bring those back to normal levels and see if that helps to reveal where the problem is before you get these unknown sources. So how do we go about stabilizing our model? I talked about some common errors, common issues that you may run into, but this will help you to not only fix your model, but maybe even avoid problems to begin with. So only build your model to answer the questions you need to answer. Don't build more things into it than you need. Start out simple, build in stages. If it's a 2D model, start with the diffusion wave equation set. That's a lot more stable and a lot faster to run. And then if you need to move into full momentum, do that once your model is complete and it's running with little to no errors. Then you can switch to one of the SWE versions of the equation set. Read your computation messages. Don't ignore those. A lot of times you'll find really good clues in your computation messages, and they may be hidden in amongst a bunch of other text, but look for computation messages that can serve as clues. Focus on the big errors that you see there. Okay, notice the location and the times when those errors show up, because that's going to direct you where and when to look in your simulation to figure out the source of the error, and then investigate further. Look for pulsing, both in 1D and 2D. Look for velocity hotspots. Check your node spacing. Okay, make sure that your cross sections are close enough or your cells are small enough to handle what you're trying to run through your model. More dynamic models, more dynamic hydrographs require closer spaced cross sections or smaller cells. Check your computation interval and use the Courant number as your guide. And I always like to tell people, when your model's crashing and you're looking for ways to fix it, there may be a number of different ways to do it. Go for the low-hanging fruit. And what do I mean by that? Low-hanging fruit, that's the easy fix. Try things that are easy to implement, like a smaller time step. That's really easy to implement. You just change the time step and rerun it. Okay. A harder fix might be adding in more cross sections or adjusting your ineffective flow areas. Okay. Changing your n values. That's not too hard, but it's a little bit harder than just changing a different or using a different computation interval. So try the easy things first, and you may find that that fixes it without having to go through a lot of effort. Understand the Courant number. This is very important. Okay, not just for 2D, but for 1D as well. Okay, I'm getting a little bit of feedback, Antonio. Okay, there we go. So check your Courant numbers. There's some guidance in the manuals if you're using diffusion wave or full momentum. Okay, and make sure you're within the guideline ranges. Okay, they make it very easy for you to figure out what time step you should use based on your cross section or cell size and the velocity that you have. And then there's a lot of ways to get help. Okay, first of all, know how HEC-RAS works. This is your job, okay, as a model builder, is to understand how RAS works. You shouldn't just open the software and press the compute button. You should understand what's happening behind the model itself. Okay, training and study is a good way to know this. So read the manuals, understand it, ask questions. Okay, my blog is a good place for some information. The RAS Solution. We have articles as well as videos up there. There's a RAS Solution YouTube page where there are a lot of videos. I do a podcast with my colleague Ben Carey. Some of you may have seen that. where it's a much more informal way to talk about HEC-RAS, but we offer a lot of tricks and tips. Craig Price, many of you probably know already, has some great videos up on the RAS Solution YouTube page, and his are very funny. He has a very funny sense of humor. Social media forums, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. These are all areas where you can explore and ask questions and hopefully get some answers. HEC has done great things in their website lately, and they have a lot of video tutorials up there now. So that's a great source of help as well. And if you haven't gotten Antonio's book yet, make sure you get his book. Now, I wish I could read Italian because then I would be able to read his entire book, but I kind of can follow it a little bit because I know a lot of the topics in there, but I know there's a lot of helpful stuff in his book. And especially if you're in Italy and you speak Italian, that's a great resource. And then I mentioned the podcast already. Also, if you get onto the RAS Solution blog, there is a great post titled "My Unsteady HEC-RAS Model is Unstable. Why?" So if you just Google that or go onto the blog and search for that title, you'll see an article I've written about models going unstable, and that links to a bunch of other help sources. Here's a really nice paper about instabilities in HEC-RAS unsteady flow models. Okay, there's another post on the RAS Solution that talks specifically about some things we talked about today, in fact. Then there's another blog that gets into troubleshooting HEC-RAS models. And if you haven't seen this presentation slide deck from Gary Brunner, I highly recommend you go find that. You can either link to it from the RAS Solution or just Google the title of it, and this will be the first thing that comes up on your computer. And go through that. There's a lot of good tips and tricks for that. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time. I hope I provided some useful information for you. I know I went a little bit longer than Antonio probably wanted me to, but I'm happy to answer any questions now that you all may have.
Thank you, Chris. Very great presentation. Now, if you have a question, please write in chat and show it at all at Chris. If not, I have 4 or 5 questions. Please write. One moment.
Yeah, and while you're thinking of questions, let me just underscore the importance of collaborating with colleagues. You know, building a network of fellow HEC-RAS users where you can run ideas across, you can ask questions, you can help them with things you've learned. That's the best way to build your experience level in stabilizing and troubleshooting HEC-RAS models, is talk and ask and discuss. And that's what we're trying to do with the RAS Solution, social media, different ways to connect and communicate with each other.
Chris, you read?
I'm sorry? Oh, yes.
You read the question?
Yeah, from Roberto.
Yeah.
In 2D models, what is the best option for the equation set, SWE-ELM or SWE-EM? So if you look in the manual, Roberto, you'll see a little bit of a discussion on this. And essentially, ELM is probably going to be the most common one for you to use when you need full momentum. It's the most broad and the easiest one to use. The EM is more for close-in studies where maybe you're modeling a very small area and you want to get a lot of detail, especially if there's a lot of turbulence and a lot of change in cross-section in terrain as you move through your system. But it's mostly going to be used for close-in, near-field, or even lab-scale models. But for your typical rivers that most of us model, or canals, dam breaks, things like that, the ELM is going to be just fine to use and will probably be the one you use most often. Now, you may not know for sure where you're at, in which case you can try both and see which one works. Now with EM, if you noticed on my previous slide, it is beholden to the Courant condition. In fact, all of your Courant numbers must be less than 1 to use the EM. Otherwise, your model will crash. Okay.
Okay.
So limitation, and that's something you'll have to deal with if you do use the EM. But yeah, if you've got time, try them both out and see if there are any differences. I would bet that you probably won't see much difference in a regular river model that most of us do.
Okay. Next question.
Okay. Can cross sections be too far apart be also a source of instability? Absolutely. Yeah. That's a very common one. When the cross sections are too far apart, RAS will commonly overestimate the energy loss, and that overestimation can lead to an underestimation in the next one, and it sets up an oscillation that can grow into an instability. So yeah, that's a very common one. So get more cross sections in there if you're seeing a lot of instability.
Okay. Next.
Is it possible to work in rivers with high slopes in HEC-RAS? It is possible. So there is a common rule of thumb that you don't want to have slopes greater than 10% or 1 to 10. And that's a good idea. The computations tend to break down. RAS has a more difficult time with steep reaches. And usually it's because they're very dynamic or fast. Things happen, change quite rapidly when you have steep systems. But you can do it. You just have to be more careful. And what you're going to find is that you need tighter spaced cross sections, so more cross sections. Or if you're in a 2D model, you need smaller cells. And with both of those, you're going to need smaller time steps as well to meet the Courant number condition. Okay, so it is possible. If you're getting above 10%, just be aware that there's going to be a lot more error in your results, even if you get your model to work. A common question I get is, can I model a spillway in HEC-RAS? Yes, you can, but be aware the answers are going to have a lot of built-in error because spillways are steep. There's a lot of vertical acceleration, which is not accounted for in HEC-RAS. And so you're going to naturally have some error, but you can make it work with close enough cross sections or small enough cells.
Chris, probably with high slopes, it's used steady flow and not a steady flow. It's correct?
Can you say that one more time? I'm not sure I followed.
Probably for high slopes, it's useful help used steady flow model and not a steady flow.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. You may find for a steep reach that you're going to have an easier time with steady flow than unsteady flow. And most of that is because steady flow is very stable. It uses conservation of energy, not conservation of momentum. But sometimes you can actually have a better result or a little more stability. I guess stability is not the right word, but you can have a better modeling experience with unsteady flow and steep reaches. So if one's giving you trouble, try the other. If it makes sense to do that.
Okay. Next.
Okay, I found a lot of problems in running 1D models in non-stationary modes where the same model works perfectly in stationary mode. Why and how can we fix this? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by stationary. Are you talking about unsteady flow versus steady flow?
One moment.
Let's assume that's the case. Okay, and the reason unsteady flows are harder is because things are changing, sometimes very rapidly, and RAS's equations don't like things to happen rapidly. And so what can we do to fix that? Well, you can use closer spaced cross sections. Okay, for a 1D model. If it's a 2D model, you can use smaller cells. You can use smaller time steps. You can also try to provide more resolution to your terrain. Whether you're doing a 1D model or a 2D model, try and provide more resolution, more detail in the terrain that you're using. That can sometimes help as well.
Okay. Chris, now try to share my screen.
Okay.
You read?
Yes. Okay. So
Okay.
from Roberto, what about 2D simulations in urban areas? What's the best way to represent buildings, little bumps, thresholds, ramps inside of a 2D area? Yeah, there's a few different ways you can do this, and a lot depends on what the objective of your study is. Is your study, is the focus what's actually happening right in a discrete area in an urban area? Then yes, you may want to actually include those buildings as part of your terrain, whether it's your cross section or your 2D area. Include those as part of your terrain. A lot of times, though, we'll have a long system-wide model. Maybe it's a dam break model, and you've got flow going down a river, and there just happens to be an urban area off on the side. Now, it wouldn't make sense to include that kind of detail, all of the buildings, let's say, in your terrain. And maybe what you do is simulate the urban area with a higher end value, and that's a common way to do it as well. But you really have two options here. You can either incorporate the losses of that urban area as a higher roughness area in your model, in which case you're not going to get a lot of detail in flow patterns and velocities in discrete areas, but it's going to be easier to set up and faster to run. The other thing is to include your buildings as part of your terrain, or some people will actually include their buildings as discrete higher end value zones. Okay, so that would simulate water being able to go into the building, but with no velocity or conveyance, which is actually probably the most accurate way to do this, because if you simulate your building as part of a terrain, then you're essentially blocking it all out. You're not letting water go inside the building at all, which can really affect your volume accounting through your model.
Okay. One moment.
All right. From Alicia, if I show water surface elevation error in the same cell, how can I resolve? Well, the good news here, Alicia, is that all of your errors, or most of them, are happening at the same place. And so you can go look at that particular cross-section and see if there's an issue with it. And how does that cross-section change from its neighbors? Okay, so a lot of times, if you have a sudden change in cross-section width or cross-section area, things like that, then RAS can have a tough time handling that transition. And so adding some more cross-sections in that zone can help. Providing ineffective flows where you need them can also help. So really, you just have to go and look at that cross-section and see what's interesting or what's happening at this cross-section or some of its neighbors that may be causing this error. But the good news is you're getting those errors, and it's telling you where the source is of that error is happening. So you can go right there and take it.
Okay. Last for a mail. A moment. Okay.
Okay, what is the maximum acceptable error in overall volume accounting error? Okay, there's no real answer, no correct answer here. It really depends, again, on the objective of your study. What are you using the model for? Okay, if you're doing something maybe close in and you're very interested in the attenuation of flow through your system, you want to get volume accounting to be pretty solid. Okay, so you're going to want to have a small error there. But maybe you're looking just reach wide. Generally, what are flow patterns? How's water going through the system? You may be able to handle a larger volume accounting error. But when I get that question, I usually tell people, if you can get a percent that is less than 0.1%, I feel pretty good about that myself. If it's between 0.1 and 1, I'm starting to think maybe there's some things I need to go fix. If it's greater than 1, then that's a problem. You need to fix that. Okay, so try and get your percent volume errors to have a few zeros after the decimal place. and then you can feel pretty good about that. If your volume accounting is very large, that is almost always because your model has gone unstable.
Okay. If you have other question, if not, and with the live, last. Chris, I have a question about Roberto, but I present. In the last version of HEC-RAS, there is no possibility to export modification terrain with in TIFF or the GIS files, because create HDF file. Okay, how can resolve this?
Good question. I have heard that. I haven't experienced it myself in 6.2 yet. Haven't gotten to that point, so I'm not exactly sure the fix for that.
Okay.
Other than, if you can open it up in an earlier version and try and bring it out that way, maybe that's a way to handle it. But it sounds like there's a problem, there's a bug in the new version with terrain modification. So unfortunately, you're going to have to work around that. Honestly, I don't know off the top of my head how to do that yet. But probably one of the first things I would try is see if it works in a different version, 6.1, let's say.
It's strange because a possibility is create HDF file and TIFF files in same time.
Okay.
We can suggest that of at HEC. Okay.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I think would be good to let them know. In fact, if you have a way to reproduce that and you want to send it to me, I can tell you if I can come up with any ideas of working around it. And at the very least, send it on to HEC and let them know that, hey, there's a bug.
Okay. Okay. If you have a question, if not end this live. Okay. Thank you, Chris.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you all for this live. Follow me at Chris in YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, HEC blog, and all LinkedIn and more. Thank you, Chris. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.